So welcome. Thank you all very much for coming to this event, which is organized by the European Institute and the Department of International Relations here at the LSE. We only have limited time, so if you don't mind, I'll keep the introductions quite short, even though you deserve a more effusive introduction. Our speaker today is Benjamin Haddad. His official title is Minister Delegate for European Affairs. In essence, he's the Deputy Minister responsible for Europe in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he's going to speak to us about Europe's strategic crossroads. Now, Benjamin Haddad is a member of parliament. He has an academic track record. He's worked and studied at Sciences Po. He spent a lot of time in Washington. So I don't think there's much to say against his ability to talk about the real wars that we're facing today, trade wars that we're facing today, the cultural wars that we're facing today, and the war of words that we face today in terms of the transatlantic relationship and everything surrounding it. The minister's going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to have about half an hour for a Q&A. Please keep in mind that this event will be recorded and will be made available as a podcast. And we'll have plenty of opportunity to ask the Minister the pertinent questions. Please welcome Benjamin Haddad.
Thank you very much, Professor. And it's really great to be here, especially because I was thinking on my way up, you were kind to say that I studied at Sciences Po. I tried to get into the dual degree with LSE. I didn't get in. So I'm pleased to be here. Not because I was a bad student, but I think I was spending too much time doing political activism at the time, and it had an impact on my score. But anyway, you were talking about the wars in Europe, and in my office, I don't have a lot of personal furniture decoration in my office because it's a very precarious job, so you shouldn't get too attached to it. But I did bring a poster that I bought in Sarajevo a couple of years ago. And it's a poster from 1995, 30 years ago, where we had a genocide on the European soil in Srebrenica. And it's a woman who's asleep with a pin with the European flag on her vest, and it says, "Europe, wake up." And there's a phrase that I've never liked that we hear a lot in the last few years when we talk about the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and we say war is back on the European continent. And the truth is, I think it's never really left. We've had the Cold War, of course, and Europe being divided into two, with half of our continent that was left behind the Iron Curtain. We had then the war in the Western Balkans in the 1990s, where the narrative in a lot of Europe was these are old hatreds, it's anachronistic, it's not about the reality of where the world is headed. Then we had Russia's aggression against Georgia in 2008. Already the annexation of Crimea and Russian troops in the Donbass in 2014 as a reaction to the pro-European Maidan movement in Kyiv. And then, of course, the full-scale aggression 3 years ago. And this happens now at a moment where, of course, we have the second term of the Trump administration, and the questions arising from the rhetoric of the US president about the future of the transatlantic relationship, about the future of the US security guarantee. And I think we're coming at a time of a strategic awakening for Europeans. And strategic awakening, I would say, the end of a form of denial. When you look at the US, I lived for 7 years in the United States, and I lived the whole first Trump presidency. And what's really struck me at the time living there as a European in DC was that I feel that there was a lot of denial from some Europeans thinking, okay, this is only going to be 4 years. Let's wait it out, clench our teeth, and then it'll go back to normal, to the traditional transatlantic relationship afterwards. But what you see is you already had under President Obama the pivot to Asia, the idea that the relationship, the rivalry with China was going to be the #1 preeminent issue for Americans, not so much the European continent anymore. You had the red line in Syria, the non-intervention after the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime, which had direct security consequences on Europeans, on Britain and France. You already had President Obama calling some European countries free riders and talking about burden sharing and Europeans needing to spend more on their own security and defense. Then you had the first Trump presidency, of course. And then even under the Biden administration, where we did a lot, of course, to support Ukraine, to respond to Russia's aggression, to sanction the Russian regime. In the first year, you had the unilateral withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was uncoordinated with European allies, including Britain, which was still on the ground. And you had the continuation of some of the protectionist trends that we've seen under the Trump administration, some tariffs, the Inflation Reduction Act, this massive subsidy program in the US economy that it was largely at the expense also of European companies. Why am I saying this? Because I think what we're seeing is these long-term trends that call for Europeans to make really decisive choices ahead of them. Either we massively reinvest in our defense and security, in our competitiveness, I'll say a word about this, in our tech, not to depend on China, the US, for AI, for quantum, for all the major tech revolutions that are ahead of us, or we'll let other countries write our history instead of us. And this is really what France and President Macron that I work with have been advocating for the last 7 years, ever since the Sorbonne speech in 2017, this idea of European sovereignty. We still work with our allies, but the idea that Europeans need to be able to take their destiny, their fate into their own hands. And I think we are seeing now a moment, because of the threat that Russia poses for all of our democracies, and because of the questions about the transatlantic relationship, we are seeing a greater than ever convergence of European strategic cultures, of European public opinions, into this idea that we need to make these decisions. We had a couple of weeks ago on March 6th, as you know, an extraordinary European Council, which was, we can talk about it in more detail, of course, which was the opportunity to announce new funding for European defense. European Commission talked about 800 billion, which is mostly about giving more leeway, more fiscal leeway for member states to invest into their own defense. We'll have to go further than that. You know, during the COVID crisis, we basically considered that this was an existential crisis for Europe, and we managed to overcome historic taboos by having a common borrowing plan, you know, the next generation EU plan to fund the recovery of our economies, 750 billion euros. Well, I would argue that we're facing a similar existential moment, and we'll also have to invest and borrow maybe tomorrow for our defense. The competitiveness, because sovereignty is not just about defense and security, although it's a lot of the conversation right now, but competitiveness, because we need to have innovators, we need to have entrepreneurs, we need to have startups stay in Europe, grow in Europe, expand, invest in Europe, so that we don't depend on the other actors. Look at what's happening right now on social media, where we have no major actor, we're dependent, and we've let so much of our information space in our democracy be shaped by actors either in the United States or in China. If we don't want to miss the next revolutions, then we really need to make sure that we have the ecosystems that are funded here, that we have people who want to take risks, want to innovate, and we have them, by the way. We have great entrepreneurs, but they still have difficulties finding the funding, going to scale, expanding. They still find that the EU has too many obstacles, even though we have the single market. We don't have a capital markets union. We don't have common corporate law. We don't have a banking union. When I talk to startup entrepreneurs, I do a lot, and we were discussing this earlier in my job. I travel around Europe. I go to Brussels on a regular basis, but I also go to France to talk to our companies, our farmers, our startup innovators. And too often when they talk about Europe, they still see a lot of regulations and bureaucracy, and they still see too many obstacles when they want to invest in another country. And that's among the things that we really need to, in a very fast way, be able to overcome and reform. That's part of our priorities. If you look at the Draghi report, which I'm sure you've discussed here, The Draghi report talks about the fact that in the last 30 years, the US has generated twice as much GDP per capita than the EU. That's mostly linked to the differential in productivity. That's about technological innovation. So if we want to catch up, we need to invest massively into tech and support these companies. In 2008, we basically had the same GDP between Europe and the United States, and now it's 30 points more in the US. So that's something also that's about the future of our continent and our sovereignty. And Draghi says you need basically 800 billion euros a year in investment, public like private, in tech, in defense, in green industry, to be able to catch up. So that's one of the ambitions that we need to have. Then I would say the first test when we talk about sovereignty, when we talk about taking our security on our hands, is of course what's happening in Ukraine. Ukrainians are fighting for their sovereignty and freedom, but they're also fighting for Europe. They're fighting not only because they're protecting the security of Europeans against the threat that represents Russia. When you look at the interferences into a democracy, I was in the last few weeks in Romania and Moldova, I could see the impact that the manipulation of algorithm, the use of social media, the intimidation from Russia is having on the electoral process in countries on our continent. When you look at the sabotage in North Sea, the cyber attacks that we have in France, we've had hospitals targeted by cyber attacks from Russia. So Ukraine, of course, is fighting for the security of Europeans, but they're also fighting for the European idea. They're fighting to get closer to us and choose, and that's a basic principle that we have on our continent, to be able to choose freely their political orientation. And so our ability to ensure a long-term peace and security in Ukraine and making sure that a ceasefire tomorrow is not just a break that Russia uses to rearm and reattack, but really gives the ability to Ukrainians to rebuild, to continue to get closer to us and to live safely, will be the first test. And this is why we had, as you know, yesterday, the summit in Paris with the Prime Minister, with President Macron, President Zelensky, and 30 European states to be able to build this. So we are at a turning point. I think this is a historic moment of change for Europe, for our security. But if we manage to seize it in the right direction, make the historic decisions that we need to make, I think this is going to be an opportunity for our continent actually to get out of this stronger, more united, more competitive, and able to write its own history.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I have a series of questions I'd like to ask you, but I'm sure that the members of the audience have even more questions. So why don't I open it up immediately to the people in the audience? Please, when you do ask a question, could you state who you are and perhaps what you're doing here at the LSE, so the minister could have an idea of where you're coming from. Peter.
Peter Wilson, Department of International Relations, LSE. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. And I find very little to disagree with what you've said. But I'd like your view on the following. If we are to spend as a continent, and I'm thinking here particularly of Britain actually, a huge amount more on defense, where is the money going to come from? Public finances across Europe, including Britain, are in a dire state. Economies are flat. That's not going to change tomorrow or the day after. Tax as a proportion of GDP in the UK is at record levels and projected to go even higher. The taxpayer is broke. As I say, the economy is flat, and yet we are committing ourselves for very good reasons to increase spending to 2.5% of GDP, and there are aspirations to increase it further. There's even talk in the UK of 4%. last week, the government committed itself quite boldly to substantial welfare cuts. But this is deeply controversial. There's no guarantee that these welfare cuts will go through Parliament. There could be quite considerable political problems for the government in getting them through Parliament. You've got the drift.
The question is, where does the money come from? But more importantly, I suppose, what are the political, social implications of increased defense spending?
We're going through exactly the same debate in France and in most European countries, as you know. Because at the end of the day, what we're seeing is we're living the end of what some call the peace dividends, where we largely outsource our security to an external actor, the United States. And now we have to catch up, both because of the threat environment that we face, that I would argue we've been facing for a while, but it's more acute now, especially with Russia's posturing, and because of the questions and the pressure coming from the United States. And it's true that first, you have to figure out where we need to spend. I'll talk about the spending, but the debates we're having also with the conversation with the European Commission and among Europeans to say, okay, where do we have dependencies? Where do we need to catch up? And this is not going to be pushing a button happening in 6 months. It's a generational effort. But if you look at drones, cyber, ammunition, long-range missiles, strategic enabling satellites, we talk about defense, but we don't enough talk about space. When you look at the role that Starlink is playing for Ukraine, I mean, this is also areas where we need to catch up quickly. And then, yes, we'll have to make economic and budgetary choices. Part of it can come through common funding at the EU level. And this is what we managed to do during the COVID crisis. And saying, okay, we have a common challenge and we need to have major investment, both from European institutions, from finance to financial institutions. Like I was yesterday in Marseille with a lot of defense industrials, and we have the European Investment Bank, which for a long time was not allowed to invest in defense. And now we've asked the bank, you actually have to be much more ambitious on defense. And that's the problem we've had with a lot of private investors as well. For a long time, defense, because of ethical rules, was not that kosher to invest in. And now, you understand that you actually need the funding and investment. So there's a mix, I think, of institutional, private funding as well. But you're completely right that when we will need to increase our defense spending, countries like the UK and France have actually not waited for this crisis to be serious defense actors. Of course, they both have nuclear deterrence, they both have projection power. The 2 terms of the Macron presidency will have doubled their defense budget, but the truth is we'll have to go faster and quicker. And we will we will need to make budgetary choices. And I will tell you, I think there's no easy answer to your question. This is also why I believe that we all collectively, not only politicians, but experts who care about this, and this is also the conversation I actually had with the private sector yesterday. We have to be engaged in the public conversation about why this is important, why this is important for our security, why this is important for our sovereignty, why actually the two are not disconnected. When you think about protecting our social welfare, protecting our freedoms, protecting our security, but it also needs to go through defense, protecting the integrity of our democracies. When you think about cybersecurity, and when you think about having autonomous tech actors in Europe rather than depending on others, it's also about defending the very fabric of our democracies. But it'll mean finding the funding, it'll mean reforming our economies, and all of these things to be able to get more funding. But you can see that every country is going through this. Look at the debate going on in Germany. It's really interesting. I think Germany is going through a major political and intellectual shift. They just amended the constitution basically to be able to invest more in defense and in infrastructure. And this is coming from a coalition that's going to be led by the Conservatives. You can see really the cultural shift that's at stake here.
Can we take a question right at the back, please?
Hi, Alyssa Shea, PhD candidate at King's College London and an alum of the LSE. I was just wondering if you could comment on the possibility of France extending its nuclear shield and deterrent to other European neighbors. How probable is this? What might the challenges be? Thank you.
Well, first, let me tell you what it isn't about, because it's often an issue that's subject to a lot of caricature in our own political debate. But it's the French nuclear deterrent, of course, is sovereign. It's the decision of the president, and so it's not about sharing the nuclear button or sharing the decision to use nuclear weapons with other countries. But we've said for a long time, the definition of what we call the vital interests that could justify the use of nuclear weapons is in the hands of the president. But we've had various presidents, including Emmanuel Macron, but already under Charles de Gaulle, the idea that there was a European dimension, the vital interest. And we've seen other countries that have been interested in the next German Chancellor, like Merz has mentioned, discussing actually how the French and the British actually nuclear deterrence can contribute to European security and how the security interests of our partners affect our vital interest. And this is a conversation that we've said, that President Macron has said multiple times that he's ready to have with other countries. I think once again, I mean, it's obviously a very sensitive issue, so I would not preempt what that would mean. But clearly, I mean, the president has said already that he's ready to have that kind of conversation with his close partners in Europe.
Do you mind if we take 2 or 3 questions at the same time? Because I see there's a lot of people who'd like to ask questions. Let me take from this side of the room. Yes, here first. In the middle.
I'm a master's student in King's College London, and my question was about, you talked about unified investment in defense, but sorry, my question was more about what about leaders like Viktor Orban that obviously have more pro-Russian stance and do not want maybe like Europe to go in that direction. So do you think that we need to have a coalition of the willing that are willing to invest in European defense and leave some people behind that are not willing? Or what do you think?
And over here, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre, for being here and for your intervention. I'm Benedetta Morali, PhD candidate at the European Institute. I work on EU foreign and security policy, and fellow Sciences Po alumna as well. My question revolves around the future of the security architecture in Europe. So right now, in response to kind of like the American detachment from the Ukraine conflict, it seems that France and the UK have taken the lead in a European, yet not necessarily EU framework. And I wonder, in your opinion, and kind of like, how do you envision the future shape of the security architecture to be in Europe, and what the role of the EU should be in it?
It's very interesting because these 2 questions are connected. Maybe a word on Hungary, and then with the broader European security architecture. You're completely right that when it comes to foreign policy and defense, the EU is a consensus organization. So you need to find agreement on 27. It's not the case on everything. There's a lot of issues that get decided at a qualified majority, but it's not the case on security and defense. And my sense is that it will stay that way for a long time, because this is really where the sovereignty of the state resides, right? When you think about sending troops abroad, of course, it will always, I believe, stay the decision of the Wednesday. And you could be both very pro-European and consider that the richness of Europe is also the 27 histories, cultures, geography, institutions that contribute to it. But it also means that it can get difficult and messy to negotiate consensus. The truth is, if you look at the last couple of European councils, we have been able to move forward. For example, the last EU Council on March 20th, you had two big pillars, I would say, one on defense and one on Ukraine. On Ukraine, we managed to land at basically sort of 27-1. So Hungary stays aside from the conclusions. And on defense, we actually find consensus on the idea of finding resources to be able to invest collectively into our defense. However, so it's a constant dialogue and negotiation with all countries, including with Hungary. However, I would stress when it comes to Hungary and other countries like Slovakia that the EU is also a values-based organization. So it's also about preserving the rule of law, defending our defending rule of law, defending principles like independence of the judiciary, independence of the media, protection of minority rights, opposition rights. And so when we've had issues with Hungary in this respect, you've had sanctions like the withholding of EU funds, and you still have EU funds from the recovery package, for example, that are withheld because Hungary doesn't comply with some of these. So I think it's when it comes to rule of law, you have to be extremely clear in defending and upholding the values of the EU. When it comes to the rest, yes, it's true that my president speaks to Viktor Orban on a regular basis. And so it's a constant negotiation with countries to be able to find consensus. But it leads to the other question, which is that I do believe that we multiply the formats. When you find the resources, I think you have EU levers are very effective. And this is why the EU, for example, with the package that President von der Leyen has proposed. And if we were, I think, to consider a borrowing plan tomorrow, we'd probably do it again at the EU level because that makes more sense. But look at the history of Europe, not just the EU. Europe, a lot of major industrial projects like the Ariane rocket or Airbus are about different countries and different companies actually cooperating together. Look at what we're doing with the UK on security guarantees for Ukraine. Of course, you can see France and the UK moving alongside together, two nuclear powers, two military powers in Europe that have decided to take responsibility and be more involved together.
Now, sorry to interrupt you. Can I just ask you a bit more about that? You are in London, we are at the London School of Economics, and I think it'll be of great interest to a number of us in the room to be a bit more specific about how the UK fits in. Because it's all right to say we cooperate and there'll be some form of participation in security architecture. But what does this actually mean? How does the French government, how does the European Council see the United Kingdom fitting into the security architecture in a practical way? How close are we to achieving it?
I mean, if you talk about Ukraine, we were quite clear yesterday that among the options, and I'm saying this, I mean, right now, of course, the war is still going on and Russia is still refusing to seriously negotiate. It has turned its back on the proposal of a truce and a ceasefire. But the idea would be to ensure a ceasefire is not just a break, but is able to deter a further aggression from Russia, to have the deployment of reassurance troops, not peacekeepers and not fighting troops, of course, reassurance troops between France, UK, and other willing partners in Ukraine. So, to protect some strategic sites. This is what President Macron said. This is, we get bogged down in a lot of institutional debates between EU, UK, different arrangements, etc. I mean, this would be something extremely specific, concrete that we would do for the security of Europe together, and we're moving forward on this. And same thing, you have just after Russia's aggression on February 24th, 2022, France pushed for the creation of the European Political Community, which is a broader platform that includes the UK, Turkey, candidate countries, Moldova, Armenia, etc., to be able to also have a platform where we can engage in all these political and security issues with partners that are not members of the EU, but also matter to the future of our continent. So I think from industrial cooperation to, major security projects like the support of Ukraine, of course, the UK fits in. That doesn't mean that some of the, that's also why I'm here in London today, that some of the post-Brexit irritants have been overcome. Of course, we still have institutional issues to deal with. But let's move forward, let's rebuild the trust, and let's also do concrete things together that don't depend just on 27 states, but on countries that are able and willing to move forward and take responsibility.
Okay, let's take some more questions. The gentleman over here at the back. Maybe take 2 questions there so you don't have to move around too much.
My name's Dario. I'm in the European Institute studying political economy of Europe, which is quite fitting. Thank you for your speech, Minister. There have been a lot of questions on security, so I was very happy that you spoke about security in a more comprehensive manner, talking about competitiveness as well. I found very interesting the fact that you approached the solution to our competitiveness issue, as seen also in the Draghi report, through a European dimension. But I was wondering, in this European dimension, we still are 27 member states that have different welfare systems, that have, you mentioned yourself, different non-tariff barriers and regulatory issues, especially in the service sector. Now, competitiveness beyond the economic sense, we could argue, even applies to security. But I wonder, as a state, and in terms of the states thinking about these issues right now, how far are states willing to give up what is seen as national sovereignty for the sake of competitiveness and for the sake of actually standing up to bigger countries on our borders, such as the US, China, and also Russia to some extent? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not at the LSE, I'm at a think tank, the Centre for European Reform, and I just wanted to push a bit further on your last comment about the UK's role in this. So I'm sure you'll know that the European defence, the white paper on defence has been out recently, and one of the notable things in that is that the UK and countries like Turkey are not necessarily going to be involved. And one of the reasons is potentially because the post-Brexit irritants you mentioned, such as fishing rights, are still a problem. You would think that this is a moment when, as you say, there needs to be a rethink of strategic culture within the EU and with like-minded partners. So do you see this changing, or do you see these irritants still holding up greater defence integration?
Let's take a couple more because we are running out of time. Can we take over here and over here?
Hi, thank you very much. I just wanted to reflect on something, which is, so you mentioned the existential nature of this moment for Europe, and I think most of us agree. And bouncing kind of off the first question, I wanted to say that the cost of living crisis has also sort of reignited existential debates against the EU, in the EU, with rising inequality and poverty fueling renewed calls for national sovereignty and skepticism towards European integration, and also some parties which are sort of closely aligned with, some parties which are closely aligned with Russia and against sort of European interests, such as in France, approaching closer and closer to power. So I'd say a lot of critics have argued that while governments have often claimed fiscal constraints when it comes to climate action and welfare spending, such as in France, rolling back on a lot of the green spendings, exceptions are often made when it comes to war and defense. How does that, sort of bouncing off of that question in terms of the European identity and a lot of skepticism toward Europe, how do you respond to people feeling that money just comes out of nowhere when it comes to war, but not when it comes to the common European project of welfare and green energy? Thank you.
Let's take one more question right here.
Hello, my name is Max Chamiré. Monsieur Haddad, c'est un honneur de vous rencontrer. A strong and independent Europe. A strong and independent Europe is a Europe that is independent on an energy point of view. I would like to have your views regarding energy-related matters. So I just read a headline this morning saying that Russia and US are discussing restarting the Nord Stream pipeline. I have seen that some Europe members are not so keen on this idea. At the same time, Europe has been impacted by a rise in energy costs following the Ukrainian war, because this meant a decrease in energy supply from Russia, which according to the supply and demand law led to a rise in energy costs. So I would like to have your view on this kind of dichotomy. We want an independent Europe, but at the same time, Europe has been impacted by a rise in energy costs. So how do you manage this kind of contrast? Thank you very much for your time.
You've got a number of issues to
Yeah.
contend with here.
Thank you.
You have the continuation of the UK-Europe relationship in terms of security. You have competitiveness and sovereignty. You have pay for defence and you don't pay for the welfare project that is the European Union, and you have the energy question. Answer whatever you want.
No, I'm not taking a bunch of questions to be able to skip one. On the first question on competitiveness, it's very interesting because I think that a lot of the issues that are discussed in the Draghi and Haddad reports, for example, like the single market union, have been, there's a French expression, serpent de mer, c'est six snake. I don't know how you translate it, but it's, these debates have been going on and on for years, and we've never been able to find consensus. Maybe I have the optimism and naivete to think that there's a greater sense of urgency, and that some of the institutional obstacles, for example, if you go into technical details, who's going to be the supervisor and authority? Where is it going to be? And is it going to be very, very centralized or very decentralized? We've been stuck on these issues for years, and I think now there's a sense that we need to be able to find solutions, move and overcome them, and that countries that were historically a little more conservative or reluctant about this are shifting. It's going to take compromises from everyone, but the interesting thing with the Draghi report, combined with the broader geopolitical pressure that we're feeling, is that it's put very clear and objective numbers on the loss of growth that it represents for the European economy and for European companies. And I like the expression you use, non-tariff barriers. That's one of the expression that he uses. I feel it all the time, as I was mentioning earlier. When I talk to companies, you would think that the single market, 450 million people, would be an extraordinary asset for Europe to affirm its power on the world stage. But still today, companies say different fiscal environment, different banking regulations, different corporate law system. And so even companies that have been very successful in France feel that if they go to Poland, to Germany, to Italy or Portugal, they have to restart from scratch. So we're losing so much opportunity here. And there's a few ideas that are out there that I find very attractive. I'll give you one that Enrico Letta tells me about all the time. Is the idea of the 28th corporate law regime. What is it? It's you have basically in Europe, you have 27 countries. So you have 27 corporate law systems. They're all the result of hundreds of years of legal heritage and traditions. You're not gonna be able to just harmonize everything. The idea would be to say, well, let's have a 28th one, and it already exists. You have lots of legal experts that have drafted one. Let's have a 28th one, and companies can choose whether they want to opt for the natural one, or if they're more oriented towards exports and developing at the European level, they could opt for the 28th one. So there's a lot of also creative ideas on how we can move forward, but I do think that we have a sense of urgency. On the UK-EU institutional relations. First, I would distinguish two things. I would distinguish the fact that we have a very close security relationship right now with the UK, and we're moving forward on what we can do for Ukraine. And the institutional and legal debates, which are trickier, we've been spending 10 years on this. But we have a summit on May 19th. We have an EU-UK summit. If I'm not wrong, I think it's the first one since Brexit. There's a lot of appetite, I think, from Europeans to actually move forward and move forward on security and defense, move forward on energy, on economic relations. So if I'm being frank, the ball is not so much on our side, it's on the UK side, because there's still a few lingering issues from the post-Brexit debate, including fisheries, which matter to a lot of people. I'm elected, and my responsibility is also to represent the interest, the security, the well-being of the French citizens, but we're not, lots of other countries, Sweden, the Netherlands, or Denmark, that have this issue. It's not the only one. but these are things that we could actually solve pretty quickly. So I would say it's not so much about us in this respect, but more about what the UK decides to do. But it doesn't prevent us from working very closely on the rest, because there is, of course, this sense of geopolitical urgency and especially on Ukraine. On the cost of living, two things on this. I mean, I would dispute a little bit the premise of the question, because yes, we are trying to find funding on defense, although when it came to the recovery of our economies, I was mentioning COVID earlier, we did put 750 billion on the table, not for defense, but really to support the economy of Europeans. But also, I mean, when it comes to France, we are finding the money for welfare state, I can tell you. I mean, 70% of the growth of our spending in the last few years has been linked to social spending. It has been linked to demographics, linked to pension or the health system. And it's important. It's also important to reform them as we have shifting demographics. So first, I wouldn't necessarily oppose the two, because I think we have different issues. I mean, we go in France through these debates on pension reform, because we have a redistributed pension system where people who work today pay for cover the pensions of people who are retired today. It's not a capitalization system where you basically save money or invest money for your own retirement later, like it is in the United States. It's normal that when you have changing demographics and the ratio of people working to people retired is smaller and smaller, it's normal that you would ask people to work longer. It's what we did 4 years ago. So I'd say, for me, it's not a zero-sum game between social spending, but you do need to reform your economies, and regardless. But the second point I would make to your question is that you have rising populism in all of our Western democracies, including in France. And sorry to say something very banal, but it's clear that the only way to answer this for me is to deliver. If we cannot make the case that pro-European liberals, I consider myself a centrist pro-European liberal, it's very boring. If we don't deliver concretely on security, on growth, on immigration, then people will naturally turn to populist parties on the green agenda as well, for sure. And so, I hate when sometimes you hear people say, we need to explain what EU does better. We need to explain. No, I mean, we need results. People see if they feel that the cost of living has changed, or if there's more or less crime, so it's our responsibility to also show that our institutions can make decisions, it can deliver. And this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges for the EU. One issue that we didn't talk about, but that's at the core of many of our conversations at EU level, is defending our borders and immigration. Why do I say this? Because it's, of course, a big driver for the far right. I strongly believe that the Schengen zone, the free circulation area we have in Europe, has been an extraordinary success for European integration. But the problem is, when you do this without making sure that you enforce the external borders of Europe, that you don't support the countries that are on these borders, then you fuel the idea that EU is borderless and can control its immigration. And so you need to get results and make the case that you can, at the EU level, actually have a humane, balanced, but a controlled immigration policy, because otherwise people will say it doesn't work and want to go back to national borders and nationalism. So you need to be able to deliver.
And 15 seconds on energy.
On energy, you're completely right for a couple of reasons. First, I would say it's definitely not time to lift sanctions on Russia. I would even say quite the opposite. I mean, Russia is stalling right now in negotiations, and so you need to increase the pressure, military, like economic. But beyond that, it's clear that the way Russia has used its energy relationship with Europe has been weaponized. It's not a normal market with supply and demand. It's been used as a geopolitical tool for leverage on our democracies. And especially the example of Nord Stream is quite eloquent on this. And this goes back to the green agenda. There's no contradiction at all between competitiveness, the green transition, and strategic sovereignty. Actually, the three go together. If we invest massively in renewables, in nuclear energy, and in interconnections, electric interconnection at the European level, then in the long run, that reduces energy cost because we don't have to import fossil fuels anymore. It fights against climate change at the European level, of course. And it reduces our geopolitical dependency to countries like Russia that have weaponized this. So I think this is sometimes a little bit missing in the conversation, because when we talk about investing in the green transition, we look at it through the lens of climate change, which is of course normal. But there's also, I think, a real good strategic argument for doing it, and an economic argument, because we don't have the energy mix of the United States. The United States now exports oil and gas. We import. So clearly we have a stake in making sure that we can become much more independent. So that's a clear, I think, objective that we need to have.
Minister, I appreciate your schedule is very tight. As you can see from the range of questions we have, you are faced with a range of issues. We're all faced with a range of issues. And I think one of the things that we don't have is time. So both in this room and in general. So I really, on behalf of everyone, thank you very much for your time and wish you good luck in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that I couldn't answer all the questions. I will tell you why, though, because it's important. I'm going to meet my British counterpart, Stephen Dodding, where we're going to talk about a range of issues, including Ukraine. And then we're co-organizing a Quince, so it's a summit of leaders from France, the UK, Germany, Italy, US, and the European Commission on the situation in Bosnia, which I think is with, but it's still with us. To really key security issues. But anyway, really want to thank you, and I can only encourage you to go into this field, which is so fascinating and so interesting right now, both in academics or in the private sector or in politics, or all of them, because I've sort of done all of them. But really, thank you for your engagement, and good luck for the rest of you.